In December of 2019, I traveled to Ghana, a country in West Africa. You know, the country you never really learned about in school. Well, while there, I visited 3 castles, and underneath the castles were dungeons, where they held the Africans for months before they forced them onto the slave ships. For more than 200 years, Africans were brutally kidnapped. They were taken from their homes and stripped from their families. They were brought to the 3 different castles the British had taken over. The men were separated from the women and were forced into dungeons. In the male dungeons, there were 5 rooms, which will hold around 250, but squished and packed in together, totaling to as many as 1,000 male Africans at a time. They were forced to sleep, eat, and defecate on the floor. There were no windows, just a small hole in the ceiling for ventilation. There would be just a little bit of light, but rest assured, that was the only light that was in there. No toilets, no beds, and hardly fed anything to eat. Many went blind because of the non-exposure to light. Every day, there would be a check on who was living and who had died. The ones who had died in the dungeons were thrown into the ocean. In the female dungeons, there were 2 separate rooms. Each had about 150 females squished and packed and fed very little to keep them alive. Any female who tried to escape was thrown into the cell with thick stone walls, no air, and no windows. They were left to die by suffocation. The females were never allowed outside unless the governor wanted to choose which one he wanted to use. They would be taken up these stairways to be raped by the governor, and many were raped by the soldiers before being thrown back into the dungeons.
The original door of no return was a very small door like this. Very small. We call this door the door of no return because the moment the Africans walked through this door, they never again came back. The first thing they saw after walking through this door was the Atlantic Ocean, and that was very surprising. They were in chains and shackles. The slave ships were about 150 or 250 meters away from here. So this is what the British soldiers did. They forced each group onto their smaller boats and transported all the African men, teenagers, and women to the bigger slave ships. And then the journey began. The journey from West Africa to the Americas took them over 4 months. The conditions were very poor. Many African women, teenagers, and men committed suicide. The African men did fight back for their freedom and right. However, all the African men who did fight back were being killed. Today, we are going to walk through the door of no return. Our ancestors walked through and they never again came.
The entire experience was heartbreakingly emotional, personally for me. But I was able to capture the experience of others who had toured the castles and the dungeons.
Definitely like being in a female dungeon or in the cell actually is what really was just hot. And I just couldn't bear it for 2 minutes, and just imagining that people was in there just to be left dead was kind of surreal. Also coming out here and seeing, the ocean and just knowing like our ancestors left and like they saw the beauty of their land. It was the last time they were seeing their land. It was a lot. It happened. And it's real. And it's still happening in just a different way. I feel like
our ancestors, like what they went through, it should make us like better people. We should be able to take care of each other as Africans, as African Americans. We're supposed to protect each other because they went through a lot to get us where we are. So, as every time I walk in these doors, I always get emotional.
I felt sad, but I literally know that I came from survivors. That's the only way I'm here. There's no other way that I got to California than being from survivors. So I just wish that more people could see this.
But anger. I understand that there was a monetary gain and why they did it, but what I can't wrap my head around is the fact that there wasn't enough people in the world to say this is wrong. Today if someone tried to do a slave trade, enough people in the world can agree that this is wrong and then take the necessary steps to stop it. But for something like this to go on for 400 years, especially since they're reading the same Bible we're reading, that's the part that absolutely blows my mind. So to describe Elmina in one word for me would be anger.
Originally, I didn't want to come.
Me too.
Okay, so originally, I really didn't want to come because for me, I think it's just really intense, but I'm so glad that I came.
Well, when we learn about the slave trade, we mostly learn about what happened after they were moved. So I think, I didn't realise that they were kept in Africa for so long.
And you never saw the conditions of the castles, and you didn't learn much about how the slaves got from Africa.
It's definitely a value to have been here today.
Thank you.